It is, this year it's 77 years since, can you do the math? World War II. And not that the number is that significant, but it's been a long time. If you grew up in Western Europe like I did, it's been a very long time when there's been peace. So throughout the Western world, at least, there's been an unprecedented time of peace and prosperity. Now, so the question is, how do we respond as, well, we know how the world responds. We've seen how Western Europe, for sure, has become more and more secular and has gone further and further away from God during that time. The more materialistic and the more prosperous we become, the further away people go from God. You know, it's kind of like the irony that God wants us to have peace and to be prosperous, but the more we get from it, the further away from Him we go. And this is kind of something that is happening now as we go back to our study in the book of Judges this week. And the series we've called God Works Through Broken People. And we should certainly see some broken people this week too. But we will also see some people who hold on to the promises of God. So I want to start with the one of the last verses in chapter 3, where Jeff left us off last week, because it says that so Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land was undisturbed for 80 years. 80 years of peace and prosperity. And in world history, that is almost unprecedented. I've tried to look at some civilizations, and I looked at my country of Norway, and since the Viking times, since we have a history about it, that is almost unprecedented. But this is the book of Judges. And then the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. So here we have this Judges cycle repeated again. We remember this from, we have the long time of peace, and then the judge dies, Ehud, from chapter 3, and now we're back in sin and idolatry again. And what happens then? Yeah, God will judge His people. And, we are in the land of Canaan. And I don't know about you, but I had this sense, I don't know, maybe it's from educational background, I don't know. It's not that we learned so much about the Canaanites, but I had this sense that they were kind of some savage tribes. So when the Israelites came there, they were just facing these savage Canaanites. Yes, they were doing evil things, but I've studied them quite a bit, and actually they were very sophisticated people. And they had fortified cities, which demands quite a bit. They made money, lots of money, as traders coming from the Mediterranean and going into Asia. They traded in all kinds of goods. One of their cities, a city-state called Ugarit, and you can look that up. They had actually, at the time, they had the largest sea vessel in the world for transporting grain. So these were not, simple people. They had a rich culture, they had education, they had literature, lots of literature. You could say that they were in some ways quite similar to what we modern people would consider us to be. It might be quite uncomfortable to see, but they were. And they were also wicked people. And the Lord sold them into the hand of Jael, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. And the commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. You know, unlike Jeff, I've been practicing the pronunciation of these words. It's quite a mouthful sometimes. Now, if you were here when we went through the series of the book of Joshua, you might remember that we spoke about the Joshua generation, right? And we remember that the generation before the Joshua generation, they rejected the promise of God to inherit promised land. They just didn't want it. They saw that it was a land flowing with milk and honey, but when they saw the inhabitants and the giants and the strength of these people, they didn't want it. In fact, they wanted to go back to Egypt, into bondage and slavery. That's how much they did not want it. And we also looked at how the promised land is also a symbol of our Christian life. But then came this Joshua generation, and they took hold of the promises of God and believed that God would give them victory. And Joshua conquered this city, Hazor, that we're now talking about. And so in Joshua 10 and 11, it says, "Then Joshua turned back at that time," sorry, it might not be there, "and captured Hazor and struck its king with the sword. For Hazor formerly was the head of all these kingdoms." It's a very important city. They had a king. They struck every person who was in it with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was no one left who breathed, and he burned Hazor with fire. It was complete destruction. Complete destruction. They rid the land of these people and their sin, which was what God had commanded them to do. So how can it be then that this Hazor is now a big city again? And there is a new king there. He actually has the same name as the former king, Jael. Well, after the Joshua generation came a new generation. And they didn't do what they were supposed to do. And they allowed the Canaanites to move back in, to rebuild the city, rebuild the fortifications, and suddenly they had a strong and mighty force there who were now suppressing them. Maybe you've heard testimonies of people, like drug addicts, for example, or people addicted to different things, and then maybe they achieved victories at some time in their life against this addiction, but then in one small moment of weakness, it's just one cigarette. What's the danger? Or one sip of the drink, and then boom. They're all back in it where they was, probably even worse than before. It seemed like they had conquered it, and then it's back again. And so whatever the sin is, it's so easy to fall back into it, and if you feed and nurture the old man in your life. Okay, good. All right, let's just go to the map then, since everybody was very focused on that. So, Hazor is up here. It's not so easy to see because our projector is so bright, but the Sea of Galilee is here. And so the Jordan River runs down, and you have the Dead Sea beyond, below now. But this is where Hazel was. And the name actually means castle or fortress. And today it is the largest excavation site in Israel. Oh, it's huge city. Or was in ancient times. And this is where Jael, he controlled the whole north of Canaan. So, the point is, even if you manage to rid your life completely of one sin, and you experience victory, you need to remain watchful. You need to pay attention, because you don't want to allow the enemy to be able to rebuild Hazel. If you let him, he will. It says in the word, don't give the enemy foothold, or don't give him opportunity. Don't walk with the people you used to walk with that always landed you in sin.
Yeah.
If you are serious about walking with Jesus, leave those people if you always end up in the wrong place. Change your friends. Protect yourself. Now, again, the cycle of the judges. The sons of Israel cried to the Lord, for he had 900 iron chariots, and he oppressed the sons of Israel severely for 20 years. Now, if you have an army of 900 chariots, you're just not a tribe of savages. This is a people with a standing army. They had even a class of officers who were paid, professional soldiers. Now, the most surprising thing is perhaps that the Israelites, they allowed this to go on for 20 years. They were severely suppressed for 20 years before they cried out to the Lord. And it's not like they repented, like we've looked at before. They didn't repent. They were just saying, oh, this is too much, but they're crying to the Lord, but they're not willing to repent. But God sends a deliverer. But in this chapter, it's going to be slightly different. So pay attention. Now, Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at that time. She used to sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. And the sons of Israel came up to her for judgment. So Deborah is a prophetess. And she shares that title with only a few women in the Bible. Do you know any of the other women who had that title? Miriam was Moses' sister. She was called prophetess. And then there was one called Huldah in 2 Kings. And then there's Isaiah's wife, who is unnamed, and Anna in the temple at the time of Jesus, and then Philip's 4 daughters. Those were it. And Deborah is clearly well respected. She's wise. People come to her. Otherwise they wouldn't. And she is hearing the voice of God. She's being obedient at a time when nobody else is. She's also a wife, so most likely also a mother. And she is the judge of Israel at this time. Now, that is unusual, obviously, because all the other judges are men. And they will all deliver Israel by military might. They are slightly different. That doesn't take anything away from her in any way. We shall see that she is definitely a hero at this time, and she's rightly remembered because she did great things for the Lord. Now, this Deborah, she sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, Behold, the Lord, the God of Israel, has commanded, Go and march to Mount Tabor, and take with you 10,000 men from the sons of Naphtali and from the sons of Zebulun. I will draw out to you Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his many troops to the river Kishon, and I will give him into your hand. So Deborah hears a clear command from the Lord, and she acts on it immediately. She summons this Barak, the leader of the army, and he has to travel quite a long ways to hear the message. The Lord now sends him back into the north, where he is going to lead the charge on the enemy. And do we have the map there again? Yeah. So he is from this Kadesh, Barak, and he has to go down all the way in the south, because all the way down here somewhere, Deborah is sitting under her palm tree, named after her. And now the command from the Lord is that he will gather people from Zebulun and Naphtali, and they will put an army on Mount Tabor, which is here, and wait for the opposing army to gather along the Kishon River, and they will meet and fight in the valley here. Okay, are you with me? So it's getting somewhere. It's a very interesting story, and there's some interesting twists here to it. So, but then Barak's response to this command is interesting, no? And he said to her, If you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. So to me, it's quite astounding that here has been 20 years of severe, cruel suppression. And finally, there is a word from the Lord saying they will be freed. The Lord will set them free. And this is the response from, I think we should suppose, one of the bravest men in Israel at the time. At least he's the leader of the army. How could he be the leader of the army if there was no bravery left in him? And this is the response. This is the response of a person with no faith whatsoever. And just think about, here is this general asking a woman to accompany him on the battlefield. What does he think is going to happen? Does he think that she's going to be a huge help for him on the battlefield? It's really strange. So there is this strong unwillingness in Barak's response. I was reminded in part of how Moses responded to God when God called him to do something that he really didn't want to, which was to go to Pharaoh. And he was trying to make excuses, and then finally he unwillingly accepted to do that which God called him to. But Deborah doesn't lose faith, because she knows this word is from God. And she says, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the honor shall not be yours on the journey that you are about to take, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hands of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh, and Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali together to Kadesh, and 10,000 men went up with him. Deborah also went up with him. So because Barak doubts the Lord's word, Deborah says that the honor for this victory will go to a woman. And that is very prophetic, but it's not going to happen the way you think, unless you know the story very well. And now for the battle, verse 11. And it says, now Heber the Kenite had separated himself from the Kenites, from the sons of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, and had pitched his tent as far away as the oak in Zaanannim, which is near Kadesh. What just happened here? Where is the battle? There was 10,000 soldiers, and suddenly we get this verse. Some fellow, Heber the Kenite, how did he happen to fall into the storyline that we were just in here? Because it's really very strange. If you're reading it, you just forget that verse immediately, because it doesn't seemingly fit into the story. But it does, very much so. This is a key verse. This is a key verse. That's why you need to pay attention when you're reading the Bible. Who are the Kenites? I don't expect you to know that. I had to look that up, of course. Now, Moses' father-in-law, he was a Kenite. Well, it does say that here in the verse. But he was the one who lived in Midian, and that's where Moses went, and he married a woman, his daughter. So finally, when the Israelites moved out of Egypt and they came to the Promised Land, Moses invited the Kenites to come with him, to be a part of their people, to have land, to live among them. Why is that important? It's coming up, okay? Just remember that. Because here we are told that this Heber the Kenite, he had separated himself from Kenites. Which means he separated himself from people of God. Okay? Now, verse 12. Now we're getting into the battle. Then they told Sisera that Barak, the son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor. Sisera called together all his chariots, 900 chariots of Aaron, and all the people who were with him, from Harosheth Hagoyim to the river Kishon. Deborah said to Barak, arise, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hands, and behold, the Lord has gone out before you. So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. Okay? This is Mount Tabor. That's what it looks like. It's pretty interesting. Natural mountain. And so all the Canaanites, they would be charging from this side, because they came in chariots, right? Chariots can be a terrifying weapon, at least when they were covered with iron plating. But when the Israelites were on top of the mountain, they were pretty safe and secure. You're not going to ride with a chariot over the mountain. And so what happens here? The Lord routed Sisera. The word routed is actually literally means confused. And all his chariots and all his army with the edge of the swords before Barak. And Sisera alighted from his chariot and fled away on foot. But Barak pursued the chariots and the army as far as Harosheth Hagoyim, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword, not even one was left. So when Barak finally does what God has called him to do, he gets victory. The Lord goes before him as he has promised, and he gets the victory. God was faithful even in his unfaithfulness. And God is sovereign, and he will work through broken people, because he will make sure that his will is done and his plans are fulfilled. But then God is not just concerned about the Israelites. That's what is so interesting in the story. He has some other people in mind too. Verse 17. Now Sisera fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. There he is again. For there was peace between Jabin, the king of Hazor, and the house of Heber the Kenite. So the battle goes on here somewhere, and they manage to wipe out the army, but the commander Sisera, he runs over the mountains here to somewhere around here, where this Heber the Kenite has his tents. We remember that he's separated from his tribe, from his people. So they used to be part of the nation of Israel. They decide to leave. So what has he done? He has made a pact with the enemy. So his wife, Jael, she went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Turn aside, my master, turn aside to me. Do not be afraid." And he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. He said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty." So she opened a bottle of milk and gave him a drink. Then she covered him. He said to her, "Stand in the doorway of the tent, and it shall be, if anyone comes and inquires of you, and says, 'Is there anyone here?' that you shall say no." What happens if you are very tired and someone covers you with a warm blanket and gives you milk to drink? The hint is that we do it to babies, and they end up falling asleep. Why? Verse 21. But Jael, Heber's wife, took a tent peg and seized a hammer in her hand, and went secretly to him and drove the peg into his temple, and it went through into the ground, for he was sound asleep and exhausted. So he died. Well, not sure I was expecting that. Now, and here is the thing. When you read this and you don't know something about the family background here, you might see this woman as some kind of crazy person. That seemed like kind of a strange thing to do. You are at peace with these people. Now we need to remember that Jael, she has been faithfully following her husband, who left the people of Israel, who left the people of the Kenites. He left the faith, he left the promises of God, and he made a deal with the enemy. And she has stood by his side faithfully, seeing him move away from God, from the promises, for all that God had for them. And now she comes face to face with this injustice of her husband, the pact with the enemy. And she doesn't hesitate 1 second. She uses the opportunity to remove the enemy's foothold in her life, in her family's life. And behold, as Barak pursued Sisera, Jael came out to meet him and said to him, "Come, and I will show you the man whom you are seeking." And he entered with her, and behold, Sisera was lying dead with a tent peg in his temple. So God subdued on that day Jabin, the king of Canaan, before the sons of Israel. The hand of the sons of Israel pressed heavier and heavier upon Jabin, the king of Canaan, until they had destroyed Jabin, the king of Canaan. If you just read quickly through the story, you might miss out on the important details. I mean, when I read this for the first time, I was like, oh, I'm not sure I want to highlight that verse. But there is something there. I think there is something very important there. Because here there are two godly women who saved the nation of Israel. Barak, he never rejected his calling to do his part. And only by the faith and encouragement of Deborah did he do what God had called him to do. And Jael, she did what her husband was supposed to do, that he wouldn't do, and she removed the enemy's foothold in her family. You know, I have to admit that it's a long time since I read the book of Judges, and so if you had asked me before I read chapter 4 if I knew the name of Deborah, I would have said yes. I wouldn't have known the story, but I would have known that there was something positive about her name. And so that was good. At least I had that settled. But if you had asked me about Barak, I would, I'm not sure I'd heard that name before. So she at least is remembered rightfully so for what she did. So what is the lesson here? Well, we have these two women who stand on God's promises. They stand on God's promises. And when all others around them fail, they do not give up. And there's something really powerful about that. When the men in their lives were weak, they kept faith in the promises of God. What was the difference between these two women and the rest of the people? Faith. Faith. What was the difference between the Joshua generation and the generation before them and after them? Faith. They faced the same challenges. But they decided to stand on the promises of God. By faith, a nation was delivered this day, and by faith, a family was delivered that day. So, in this way, this story of Deborah is very encouraging. If your family is in bondage or under some continual siege by the enemy, then you have absolute right to stand on the promises of God. You know, as it says in Ephesians, put on the full armor of God, wear the shield of faith, wield the sword of the Spirit. I think that's what these women did that day. And if you're struggling with personal sin that has come back, maybe you were victorious, and then in a moment of weakness, you realize that I haven't conquered that at all. I allowed the enemy to rebuild a stronghold in me. Hazor is still there, fortified, rebuilt. What is God's promise to us then with regards to sin? Romans 6:14 says, for sin shall not be master over you, for you are not under law, but under grace. If you've fallen back into sin that you want to defeat, then God has a promise for you. Romans 6:14. Sin shall not have dominion over you. If you have put your faith in Jesus, you are not under law, but under grace. That's why you can stand on God's promises.